marry me?" She said it before she could stop herself. Standing in the freezing cold, hat in hand, pride completely gone. Caleb Walker stared at her. Didn't blink. Didn't flinch. And then, without a single moment of hesitation, he said, "Yes." Lillian Whitmore had prepared for rejection. She had not prepared for that. Because what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that this man had been waiting for her to knock on that door for 6 long years. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The morning Lillian Whitmore rode toward Caleb Walker's ranch, she had exactly $4.30 in her coat pocket, a horse with a cracked left shoe, and a name written on a folded piece of paper that she had read so many times, the ink was starting to blur. She had not slept. She had not eaten since the previous afternoon when she'd shared half a biscuit with that same horse because she felt guilty watching him search the frozen ground for grass that wasn't there. The temperature had dropped overnight in a way that felt personal, the kind of cold that gets inside your coat, inside your bones, inside your thinking, until the only thoughts left are the ones that ask you what exactly you believe you're doing out here. Lillian Whitmore, 29 years old, daughter of the late George Whitmore of Stillwater County, was riding toward a man she had spoken to exactly 3 times in her life. She was going to ask him to marry her. She told herself it was practical. She told herself it was smart. She told herself it was the only logical option remaining after every other option had collapsed beneath her like rotten floorboards one after another in the span of 4 brutal months. She did not let herself think about how desperate it actually was. Not yet. That kind of thinking could come later when she was warm. If she was ever warm again. The farm had gone first. Her father had borrowed against it twice, once when the first drought hit, and once when the cattle sickness swept through the valley 3 winters back. He'd always said he'd pay it back. He'd always been a man who believed next season would be better. George Whitmore was not a foolish man. He was just an optimistic one, and in Montana sometimes those two things end up looking exactly the same. He died in October quietly in his sleep, which was the only quiet thing that happened that entire month. Because the bank that held the second loan did not wait for grief to pass. They sent a man named Terrence Polk in a clean coat and good boots who sat across from Lillian at her father's kitchen table and explained, with what she supposed he thought was compassion, that the estate was insufficient to cover the outstanding debt. The farm would need to be sold. "How long do I have?" she asked him. 60 days, he said. That's what the contract allows. She had sat very still while he said it. She'd learned that trick from her father, keep your face calm when bad news lands, because the moment you let it show, people start making decisions for you. People start treating you like someone who needs to be handled rather than heard. "Thank you, Mr. Polk," she said, and she waited until he left before she put her head down on that kitchen table and cried in a way she hadn't cried since she was 8 years old. 60 days became 45. 45 became 30. She sold what she could. Her mother's silver candlesticks, the good furniture, a set of encyclopedias her father had ordered from a catalog and never actually read but was very proud of owning. She tried to find work in town. The general store said they weren't hiring. The schoolhouse already had a teacher. The widow Mrs. Cartwright, who ran the boarding house on the east end of Harlow, told Lillian she was sorry, but she simply didn't need any help at the moment. Mrs. Cartwright said it with that particular look, the one that meant, "I know what's happening to you, and I cannot afford to get involved in it." Lillian recognized the look. She'd probably worn it herself once or twice when someone else's trouble was standing at her door. She didn't blame the woman, she just walked away. She tried 3 other towns within riding distance. She wrote letters to her cousin in Helena, who wrote back with warmth and apologies and a very detailed explanation of why their house simply had no room. She contacted a land agent about finding a buyer willing to assume the debt rather than liquidate everything, and he told her the market was bad and the land was in poor condition, and honestly, she should count herself lucky the bank was being patient. She did not feel lucky. By the time the landlord, the man who owned the small room she'd been renting since the farm sold, knocked on her door with his final notice, Lillian had run out of options in every direction she could think to look. Except one. She pulled out the folded piece of paper. She unfolded it for what felt like the 100th time. Caleb Walker. Broken Ridge Ranch. North of Harlow, off Miller Creek Road. She'd written that name down 6 weeks ago, when old Hector Briggs at the feed store mentioned that Walker was looking for help with his ranch records. Said the man was honest and paid fair. Said he kept to himself, but wasn't the type to cause trouble. She'd thought about it then and decided she had better options. She no longer had better options. She folded the paper back up. She put it in her coat pocket. She looked at the room around her, the single cot, the small window, the hooks on the wall where she'd hung her father's old hat because she couldn't bring herself to pack it away, and she made a decision. Not the decision she'd originally planned, which was to ask about the ranch records job. A different decision, a harder one. The only one that made any sense at all if she wanted to still have a roof over her head by the end of the week. She rehearsed what she would say the entire ride out. She tried formal first. Mr. Walker, I want to propose a mutually beneficial arrangement. Too stiff. Too much like a business contract, which she supposed it was, but saying it out loud like that made her sound like she was reading from a document. She tried direct. I need to get married, and I need it to happen quickly. True, but it made her sound unhinged, which she was not. She was practical. There was a difference. She tried honest. I've lost everything, and I'm out of choices, and I'm asking you to consider a marriage of convenience because I have nowhere left to turn. She stopped the horse. Sat there in the cold wind for a minute. That one was also true, she thought. But it was also the kind of thing that once you said it out loud to another human being could not be unsaid. It would be sitting there in the air between them for as long as they were in the same room together. She started writing again. She told herself that honesty was the only strategy she had left, so she might as well use it. The gate to Broken Ridge Ranch was a plain iron arch with the name welded in simple letters across the top. Not fancy. Not trying to be anything it wasn't. She appreciated that briefly before the nervousness came back so hard it almost took her out of the saddle. You've done harder things, she told herself. She couldn't immediately think of any, but she kept writing anyway. The barn was to the left. The house was straight ahead, a solid 2-story structure, not new but well kept, the kind of place someone had put real time into maintaining without bothering to decorate. There was firewood stacked high and tight against the east wall. Good firewood split clean and dry, which told her the man who lived here thought ahead and worked carefully. She noticed things like that. Her father had taught her to read a homestead the same way you'd read a person look at what they actually maintain, not what they say they take care of. A dog barked once from somewhere around the side of the house, then stopped. Which was also interesting, a dog that barked once to announce a stranger, and then waited. Not aggressive, just informing. She dismounted, tied the horse to the post by the front steps, took off her hat because she'd been told it was polite, then put it back on because she needed something to hold. She climbed the steps. She knocked. Boy. He opened the door within 30 seconds, which meant he'd probably heard her coming up the road. He was taller than she remembered. They'd met briefly at the grain auction 2 years back, and once at the hardware store, and once at a church social that she'd attended, and he'd apparently wandered into by accident and left quickly. And in none of those 3 encounters had she really been paying attention to his height. She was now. It was a lot of height. He had dark eyes that were steady in a way that was either very calm or very guarded, and she genuinely couldn't tell which. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold, which either meant he'd been inside near a fire, or he simply didn't feel cold the same way other people did. He looked at her. He waited. Mr. Walker, she said. Miss Whitmore, he said, which surprised her because it had been 2 years since the grain auction, and she hadn't been sure he'd remember. I need to talk to you, she said, if you have a few minutes. He stepped back from the door. Come in, he said. The inside of the house was warm. There was a fire going in the main room, a good steady fire that had clearly been burning for hours, and Lillian felt the cold start to leave her fingers almost immediately. She stood in the doorway of the main room and tried to collect her thoughts, which had rearranged themselves into a scrambled and unhelpful order somewhere between the porch and the threshold. There was a kitchen table with 2 chairs, a lamp burning on a shelf, a coat on a hook by the door that had seen hard weather and wasn't bothered by it. Caleb Walker stood in the middle of the room, and he did not try to fill the silence. That was, she would think later, the first thing she noticed about him. He didn't fill silence the way most people do with chatter or questions or nervous movement. He just stood there and waited for whatever she had come to say. She found that either comforting or terrifying, and she still couldn't decide which. "I want to be straightforward with you," she said. "I'd appreciate that," he said. "I'm in a difficult position," she said. "I've been in one for a while, but it's gotten significantly worse in the last few weeks, and I have—" She paused, because the rehearsed version was dissolving in the actual room with the actual man in front of her. "I have come to you because I don't have anywhere else to go, and I think you should know that before I say anything else." He nodded. "Just once. My father's farm is gone," she continued, and she was proud of how steady her voice was. "The bank took it in November. I've been renting a room in town, but I've been given notice. I can't find work. I have no family close by. I've spent 6 weeks trying every other option I could think of." She stopped. He waited. "I want to propose a marriage," she said. "A practical one. Not a romantic arrangement. A working arrangement. I can manage records, run household accounts, help with a cattle operation. I'm organized. I'm not fragile. I work hard, and I don't complain." She took a breath. "In exchange, I need a home, and I need some protection through this winter. That's the honest truth of what I'm asking." The silence that followed was the longest 4 seconds of her life. Then Caleb Walker said, "Yes." Just that, one word. Lillian blinked. "You—" she started. "Yes," he said again. "I'll marry you." She stared at him. "You're not going to think about it," she said. "I don't need to," he said. "Mr. Walker, I just—" She was working to keep her voice even. "I just proposed marriage to a man I've spoken to 3 times. You might want to think about it." "I've thought about it," he said. Which was such a strange and specific answer that it stopped her entirely. "You've thought about it," she repeated. "Yes," he said. She searched his face for something mockery or pity or the specific look of a man who was about to explain that he was already married or committed or simply not in his right mind. She found none of those things. His face was serious and still and entirely sincere. "Why?" she asked. She hadn't planned to ask that. It came out before she could stop it. He looked at her for a moment. "Because you came here," he said, "and you were honest, and that matters to me." It was not, she thought, a complete answer. But she was cold, and she was out of options, and his fire was warm, and he had said yes. She let it stand. They married 4 days later. The ceremony was in the county clerk's office on a Thursday afternoon. With a woman named Doris Faherty as witness, she worked at the clerk's office and agreed to stay an extra 15 minutes at the end of her shift. The ceremony took 8 minutes. There was no music. There were no flowers. Lillian wore her best dress, which was clean and presentable, but showed wear at the cuffs, and Caleb wore a dark jacket that fit him well and had clearly been pressed recently, which meant he had bothered to prepare, which she noted without commenting on. They signed the papers. Doris Faherty congratulated them with genuine warmth. They walked out into the January cold as husband and wife. On the ride back to Broken Ridge, they did not speak for almost 20 minutes. The silence was not uncomfortable exactly. It was more like 2 people who had made a very significant decision and were now sitting with the reality of it. Finally, Lillian said, "I want to be useful to you." Caleb glanced at her. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I know I don't," she said. "I want to be. There's a difference." He turned back to the road. "I've got records going back 12 years that haven't been organized since my uncle left," he said. "If you want something to do, that would be a place to start." "I'll start tomorrow," she said. "All right," he said. And that was that. She started tomorrow. The records were in a state that should have embarrassed someone. Except Caleb had apparently long ago made peace with the fact that he was a man who was excellent at raising cattle and deeply inadequate at paperwork. There were receipts stuffed into envelopes, stuffed into a wooden crate. There were ledger books with entries that stopped mid-year and then resumed in a different ink, as if the first pen had simply given up. There were supplier invoices with no corresponding payment records. There were payment records with no corresponding invoices. Lillian sat down in front of that crate on her first full morning at Broken Ridge and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Purpose. Not happiness, not yet, but purpose which was close enough to be getting on with. She worked through the morning without stopping. Caleb came in for a brief lunch. He made coffee and left a plate of biscuits on the table without commentary and went back outside. She didn't look up. He didn't disturb her. By late afternoon, she had sorted 6 years' worth of records into a system that actually made sense. By evening, she had found 3 discrepancies in the supplier accounts that were significant enough to be interesting. She brought them to Caleb after supper. He was sitting near the fire with a mug of coffee reading a water rights document that looked like it had been read many times before. "I found some things," she said. He looked up. "In the Hendricks supply accounts," she said, sitting down across from him and spreading 3 sets of documents on the table. "You've been paying for a full shipment of winter feed additive every quarter for the past 4 years, but the delivery records only show 3/4 shipments, every time." He leaned forward. "Are you certain?" he said. "I'm certain about 4 of them," she said. "I want to go through another 2 years of records before I say anything more definitive. But if the pattern holds, someone has been billing you for materials you never received." Caleb looked at the documents. He was very still. "Hendricks has been my supplier for 9 years, he said. "I know," she said. "The relationship goes back to your uncle's time, which is probably why it's been so easy to hide." He sat back. His jaw was set in a way that was not anger exactly. It was more like a man recalculating something important. "How much?" he said. If the pattern holds for the full period, she said somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000. The number sat between them. "I'll need 2 more days to confirm it," she said. "Take the time you need," he said. His voice was careful and quiet, and she could hear underneath it something that surprised her. Not just anger at the theft, but something that sounded like relief. As if the fact that the numbers had never made sense had been a weight he'd been carrying, and now at least there was an answer for why. "All right," she said. She gathered the documents. She stood to go back to her room. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She turned. He caught himself. "Lillian," he said, correcting it, as if he'd only just remembered what the paperwork actually said now. "Thank you." She nodded. She went to her room. She lay in bed for a long time staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside, and the settling sounds of an old house, and she thought about the way he'd said thank you, not perfunctory, not polite. Actual. Like he meant it in some specific and considered way. She thought about how quickly he'd said yes when she proposed. "I've thought about it," he'd said. She turned that over a few times. Couldn't make it come out to anything that made complete sense. She filed it away and went to sleep. The first week passed, then the second. They established a rhythm without discussing it, which Lillian found she preferred to having every small domestic arrangement made into a conversation. Caleb was up before dawn. Lillian rose at 5:30, made coffee started on whatever records or accounts she was working through that day. He came in for meals. She cooked because she was better at it, and because having something useful to do with her hands while her mind worked through a problem had always suited her. They talked over supper. Not much at first and about nothing personal, the cattle markets, the weather, the supplier situation, which she confirmed by the end of the first week, and which Caleb addressed by riding into Harlow and having what the hardware store owner later described to 3 different people as a very quiet and very uncomfortable conversation with Dale Hendricks. Hendricks denied it. Caleb laid the documents on the man's counter and waited. Hendricks went pale. The situation was resolved within 2 weeks, including a repayment arrangement that Lillian drafted herself, because she did not trust Hendricks to write something legally sound in his current state of panicked contrition. The town noticed. In a place the size of Harlow, the town always notices. And what the town noticed was that Caleb Walker's new wife, who had arrived out of nowhere under circumstances that people were very comfortable speculating about, had walked into his ranch operation and almost immediately uncovered something significant. Some people found that impressive. Others found it suspicious. "She's clever," a woman named Vera Hutchins said in the post office to 2 other women, in a tone that made it clear clever was not a compliment in this context. "Showed up with nothing. Now she's got her hands in his accounts." "Maybe she saw an opportunity," someone said. "Maybe she planned the whole thing," Vera said. "Maybe that's exactly why she came here." These conversations got back to Lillian, as conversations in small towns always do, through a circuitous route involving Doris Faherty from the clerk's office, who had apparently decided she liked Lillian and thought she should know what was being said. Lillian sat with that information for a day. Then she went back to work. She'd been at Broken Ridge for exactly 3 weeks when she found the blanket. She had come downstairs in the dark, earlier than usual, before 4 o'clock, because she hadn't been sleeping well, and at some point, the effort of lying in bed trying to sleep had become more exhausting than simply getting up. She wrapped herself in her coat and came down to restart the fire. There was a blanket on the chair nearest the staircase. It was not her blanket. It was a heavy wool blanket, dark green, folded neatly. Warm it had been near a heat source recently, and it was on the specific chair that happened to be the first place she usually sat when she came downstairs. She picked it up. She stood there in the dark, holding a blanket that had been left for her before she was awake enough to know she'd needed one, and she felt something shift inside her chest in a way she hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to categorize. She had not told him she was sleeping poorly. She had not told him she sometimes came down early in the cold. He had noticed anyway. She didn't mention the blanket at breakfast. Neither did he. But she started paying closer attention after that. The kind of attention you don't mean to pay, but can't help once you start the noticing of small things that weren't there before, or were there and you hadn't looked. Her saddle, which had a cracked cinch strap that she'd been meaning to get fixed when she had the money, was repaired one afternoon while she was inside working. She hadn't asked him. She hadn't mentioned it. A tin of salve appeared on the kitchen windowsill on a day when her hands had been cracked raw from sorting through old dusty records. She asked once casually whether he'd used it. He said he hadn't needed it lately. The water in the barn trough was always broken ice when she went out in the mornings, which meant someone was going out before she arrived to break it in the dark and the cold without being asked. None of it was grand. None of it announced itself or asked for recognition. It was just there. Steady and quiet and consistent, like a current running under the surface of the daily life of 2 people who were still figuring out how to share a house. She found herself watching him more than she'd intended to. He was not. She was learning the cold and distant man the town described. He was private. There was a difference. She'd noticed that distinction before with other people, but it was clearest with him. He didn't share himself easily or automatically, but when he did, he meant it. He was not performing indifference. He simply didn't operate loudly. There was a conversation at supper about 3 weeks in, where she'd mentioned, not emotionally, just in passing, the way you'd note a weather fact that her father used to read to her in the evenings when she was small. Poetry, mostly. Robert Frost. Things like that. Caleb looked at her from across the table. "Something there is that doesn't love a wall," he said quietly. Just the first line, not showing off, not making a point, just offering it, recognizing something. She stared at him. "You know Frost," she said. "Some of it," he said. "You didn't seem like someone who would," she said honestly, before she could decide whether that was rude. He almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen, yet the corner of his mouth moved. "People usually don't," he said. And then, after a pause, "My mother, she read to me too." Lillian looked at her hands. "How long has she been gone?" she asked. 8 years, he said. "I'm sorry," she said. "She would have liked you," he said. And then he stood up and took his plate to the kitchen with the quiet efficiency that was simply how he moved through his own house, as if he hadn't just said something that sat in the room like a warm light after he left it. Lillian sat at that table for another 10 minutes without moving. She was not falling in love with him. She was clear on that. She was a practical woman in a practical arrangement. And she had enough self-awareness to know that warmth from an unexpected source, safety from an unexpected source, could feel like something it wasn't, especially when you'd been cold and frightened for a long time. But she was noticing him, really noticing him. And the more she noticed, the more she found herself wondering about the question she had been turning over since the first afternoon in this house. "I've thought about it," he'd said. Why she'd asked. "Because you came here, and you were honest." It was not, she had decided weeks ago, a complete answer. It was an answer that explained what he thought of her proposition. It did not explain why he had no hesitation, why one word yes was the only response he'd needed to give. She hadn't asked again. She would later wonder why she waited so long. It was Doris Faherty who said it first. She came out to the ranch one afternoon on a social call, or what she described as a social call, though Lillian suspected there was also significant curiosity involved, and sat at the kitchen table with coffee and talked freely for an hour, in the manner of a woman who had been waiting for someone to talk freely to. "The town's talking," Doris said, which was not a surprise. "I know," Lillian said. "Vera Hutchins says you married him for his land." "People believe what they want to believe," Lillian said. "Caleb told Tom Hadley, you know Tom runs the grain elevator, that you'd found $12,000 of fraud in his supplier accounts." Doris leaned forward. "Tom told me Caleb said—" She paused, as if deciding whether to share it. "He said, she came here with nothing, and she gave this ranch everything." Lillian's hands went still on her coffee cup. "He said that. That's what Tom said." Doris looked at her with an expression that was warm and also a little searching. "He's not a man who talks much. People notice when he does." Lillian didn't respond. "Can I ask you something?" Doris said. "You can try," Lillian said. "Did you know him before? I mean, know him more than just the auction and the social and the hardware store?" Lillian looked at her. "Why do you ask?" "Because," Doris said, and she hesitated, which was not like Doris. "Because the way he said yes to you, the clerk told me she was right there. The way he said it, there was something in it. Like he wasn't surprised. Like he'd been—" She shook her head. "I don't know. Never mind. I'm being fanciful." "Like he'd been what?" Lillian said. Doris looked at her. "Like he'd been waiting for you to ask?" she said. The kitchen was very quiet. "That's fanciful," Lillian said. "Probably," Doris agreed. But neither of them dismissed it entirely. And after Doris left, Lillian sat in the kitchen for a long time with her cold coffee and the particular feeling of a thought that won't let itself be put away. "I've thought about it." 6 years, the title of this story said. 6 years. She pushed it aside. She went back to work. But it had taken root, that thought. And some things once planted grow, whether you tend them or not. A month into their marriage, the first real argument happened. It started small, they always do. She had been reorganizing the cattle sales records and found a contract renewal with a buyer named Marcus Greer that struck her as significantly below market rate. She brought it to Caleb. She was direct about it because directness was her way. "This contract is undervalued by at least 15%, she said. "Marcus is a fair buyer," Caleb said. "I'm sure he is," she said. "He's also currently paying you 15% less than you could get from a competitive quote." Marcus and I have an arrangement, Caleb said. His voice was not angry, but it was careful, the particular careful of a man who felt territory being approached. An arrangement that costs you money, she said. An arrangement built on 10 years of reliability, he said. There's a value to that. There is, she said. That value isn't 15%. Lillian. Caleb! She met his eyes directly. I understand loyalty. I understand the value of a relationship that holds when things get difficult. I'm not telling you to abandon Marcus Greer. I'm telling you that you could negotiate a better rate, and Marcus Greer, if he's as fair as you say, would understand that. Silence. His jaw worked slightly. You've been here a month, he said. And that landed differently than anything else he'd said. Not because it was cruel, his voice wasn't cruel, but because it was true, and she'd been operating with a certainty that maybe she hadn't fully earned yet, and she felt the correction land in her chest. She sat back. You're right, she said. He looked at her surprised. She thought that she'd said it that quickly. I've been here a month, she said more quietly. This is your ranch. These are your relationships. I shouldn't speak as if I have the full picture when I've only seen a portion of it. Caleb studied her for a moment. The rate is too low, he said. I know it is. I've known it for 2 years. She waited. But Marcus Greer sent men to help when I broke my leg 3 winters back. He didn't ask. He just sent them. 4 men for 2 weeks to keep this place running while I was down. She didn't say anything. I haven't figured out how to put a number on that, Caleb said. Lillian looked at him. Then let's find one together, she said. The silence that followed was different from the one before. All right, he said. And that, Lillian thought, was the first moment that felt like a real partnership. Not the marriage certificate. Not the shared house or the shared work or the meals at the same table. This moment, disagreement correction meeting in the middle. This was the first thing that felt like something they'd both actually chosen to build. She didn't know sitting at that table that they were only just beginning. She didn't know what was coming. She didn't know about the locked building behind the barn. She didn't know what was inside it. She didn't know that every answer she'd been turning over since that first afternoon. Why did he say yes so quickly? Why does he do these quiet things? Why does he look at her? Sometimes like she's something he recognized before she arrived, was sitting in that locked building, written in a hand she had never seen before. 6 years of waiting. She had no idea. 6 years earlier, Caleb Walker had written his first letter. He would never send it. But he would keep writing. And everything Lillian Whitmore was only beginning to discover about the man she had married, the real story, underneath the practical arrangement, the thing that made a man say yes without hesitation to a woman who had knocked on his door out of desperation, all of it was waiting for her. In a locked building behind the barn. In a chest with her name carved into the wood. The second month was harder than the first. Not because anything had gone wrong. If anything, things had gone quietly surprisingly right. The accounts were organizing themselves into coherence. The Hendricks repayment was proceeding on schedule, and the daily rhythm of Broken Ridge had absorbed Lillian into it with less friction than either of them had probably expected. No, the second month was harder because Lillian had stopped being numb. The first month, she understood now she had been running on the particular fuel that desperation generates, purpose without feeling movement, without reflection. You do what needs to be done. You don't stop to think about what any of it means. You sort the records you make, the coffee you find, the fraud in the supplier accounts. You go to sleep, you get up, you do it again. But somewhere in the middle of the second month, that fuel ran out. And what replaced it was something she hadn't been prepared for, the specific complicated weight of being safe. Of having a roof that wasn't being taken from her. Of knowing where she would sleep tomorrow night, and the night after that. Of sitting at a table across from a man who left blankets on chairs before she knew she needed them, and repaired saddles without being asked, and said she would have liked you about his dead mother, in the same quiet voice he used for everything else. Safety, she discovered, was not simple. It didn't just feel like relief. It felt like grief too, because the moment you stopped running from the fear, you had to look at everything the fear had made you leave behind. She missed her father. She missed the farm, not the debt and the failure of it, But the particular smell of the barn in summer, and the way the kitchen had always been warm, and the sound of her father's voice reading Robert Frost in the evenings. She missed who she had been before October, which was a version of herself who still believed that working hard and being honest were sufficient protection against disaster. She sat with all of this at night in her room in the dark, in the kind of silence that a solid old house makes when the wind is outside and the fire has burned low. And then she got up in the morning and worked, because that was what she did. And because if she was being completely honest with herself, which she tried to be always, even when it was uncomfortable, the work was the only thing right now that felt like solid ground. That and Caleb. Not in the way she kept having to remind herself it wasn't. Not romantically. Simply as a presence. As a person whose steadiness she had stopped taking for granted, because she'd lived around enough unsteady people to know that it was not in fact the default. She thought about what Doris had said, like he'd been waiting for you to ask. She thought about it more than she meant to. She was 3 weeks into the second month when the trouble with the town became impossible to ignore. It had been building in small ways a coolness at the general store. A conversation that stopped when she walked in, a look from Vera Hutchins at the post office that communicated without a single word exactly what Vera Hutchins thought of the whole situation. Lillian had been managing it by declining to engage. She was not a woman who needed everyone to like her. She had never been that woman. But she was also not a woman who particularly enjoyed being the subject of a narrative she hadn't agreed to participate in. The narrative, as best she could reconstruct it from the fragments that reached her, went something like this. Lillian Whitmore, having lost her father's farm through her own family's financial mismanagement, had deliberately targeted Caleb Walker because he was wealthy by local standards and known to be solitary, therefore presumably lonely and therefore presumably vulnerable to a woman willing to present herself as desperate. The most charitable version of this story cast her as calculating. The less charitable version had additional details that Doris delivered to her with genuine apology one afternoon, including a rumor that she had been carrying on with a man in Billings who had thrown her over, which was why she'd ended up back in Harlow with nothing. "There's no man in Billings," Lillian said. "I know that," Doris said. "I've never been to Billings." "I know that too." Doris looked troubled in a way that meant there was something else. Vera Hutchins spoke to Margaret Callie. Margaret's the wife of the man who holds the note on the East Pasture parcel. "I know who Margaret Callie is," Lillian said. "What did Vera say to her?" She suggested. Doris said carefully that Caleb might want to be careful about having his financial records in the hands of someone who'd only been here 2 months. Lillian was very still. She suggested that to the wife of the man who holds a note on Caleb's property. She said, "Yes." "That's not gossip," Lillian said. "That's interference." "I know," Doris said. Lillian stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there for a moment with her back to Doris, working through what she wanted to do with the anger that had arrived with such sudden clarity it almost took her breath away. "Does Caleb know?" she asked. "I don't think so," Doris said. "I don't think anyone would have told him directly." "No," Lillian agreed. "They wouldn't." She turned around. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "What are you going to do?" Doris asked. "I'm going to tell him," Lillian said. "Tonight, because if I don't, and he hears it from someone else later, it'll look like I was hiding it, and I won't have that." Doris looked at her for a long moment. "You're a particular kind of person," she said. "I mean that well." "I know you do," Lillian said. She told him after supper. She sat down across from him at the table, and she laid it out plainly what Vera had said, who she had said it to, and what the potential consequences were for the note on the East Pasture. Caleb listened without expression. He sat very still in the way he did when he was processing something serious, the way she'd come to recognize as thinking, rather than dismissal. When she finished, he said, "How long have you known about Vera?" 3 weeks, she said. "About her and the general opinion, yes. About what she said to Margaret Callie since this afternoon." "Why are you telling me now?" She met his eyes. "Because I'm telling you everything," she said. "That was the agreement. I help you run this place honestly. That means I don't manage which information you get to have." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's not nothing," he said finally. "No," she agreed. "It's not." He stood. He walked to the window, the same gesture she'd made an hour ago at her conversation with Doris. She noticed this family resemblance of frustration, and he stood there with his coffee. "Ted Callie will talk to me," he said. "I'll go into town tomorrow." "What will you say?" "The truth," he said. "That you found $12,000 of fraud in my accounts in your first 2 weeks here. That if someone's concerned about who's handling my records, they're welcome to look at my records because they've never been in better shape." He turned. "And that what Vera Hutchins chooses to say at the post office is not something I'm willing to manage, but interfering with my property arrangements is a different matter." Lillian looked at him. "You don't have to defend me," she said. "I can handle what people say about me." "I know you can," he said. "This isn't about defending you. This is about making clear that I know what's happening in my own house." Something about the way he said "my own house," not as a possession, not as a territorial claim, but as a statement of personal integrity. "This is mine, and I know what it is," landed differently than she expected. "All right," she said. He went to town the next morning. She didn't ask what he said to Ted Callie. Ted Callie didn't raise the matter of the note again. It was in the third week of February that things changed in a way that Lillian would mark later as significant. She had been working in the kitchen after supper, going over a set of records from the previous spring's calf sales. Caleb was nearby doing something with a piece of harness that needed mending. It was a comfortable silence. She had learned by now that comfortable silence with Caleb was actually the natural state of the house, that conversation was something they moved in and out of, rather than something that had to be maintained, and that she had come to rely on the steadiness of that. Then he said, without looking up from the harness, "What did you want to be?" She looked up. "What?" "Before all this," he said. "When you were younger, what did you think you'd do?" It was such an unexpected question that it took her a moment to locate the answer. "A lawyer," she said. "Or something like it, something with documents and evidence and arguments. I was good at finding the flaw in a position." She paused. "My father thought it was a fine idea. My mother, before she passed, thought I should think about something more practical." "Law isn't practical," Caleb said. "Not for a woman in Montana in 1912, apparently." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. She registered it the way you register a rare and remarkable thing. "What about you?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to go west," he said. "Further west. California, maybe. I had an idea when I was about 20 that I'd go see the ocean." "And," she said. "My father got sick," he said. "Then the ranch needed someone. Then it was just mine. You stop asking what you wanted once it becomes what you have. Do you regret it?" He looked at her, then directly, which he did rarely enough that it always carried weight. "No," he said. And then after a pause, "Not anymore." The "not anymore" sat in the air. She looked back down at her records. Neither of them said anything else for a while. But the silence was different after that. It had the texture of something understood rather than something simply shared. She did not pull at that thread. Not yet. But she could feel it there. The Hells Angels arrived on a Thursday in early March. She heard them before she saw them, a sound unlike anything this valley usually produced, a deep mechanical rumble that seemed to come from the direction of the main road and grow louder with a deliberateness that suggested it was not accidental. She was in the barn when they rode through the gate. 7 men on motorcycles dressed in dark leather, road-worn and deliberate. They pulled into the yard and stopped, engines cutting out one by one, and the sudden silence they left behind felt enormous. Lillian walked to the barn door. Everything she'd heard about the Hells Angels, which was considerable, because people in Harlow had been talking about a group of bikers seen heading toward Montana for 2 weeks, was not encouraging. They were trouble. They were violent. They were the kind of men who brought chaos wherever they went and left ordinary people dealing with the aftermath. She watched them from the barn door. 7 men. One of them, the one in front, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, with a calm about him that contrasted sharply with everything she'd imagined, was looking directly at the house. Caleb came out of the house. He stopped on the porch steps, and then he walked down them, crossed the yard, and held out his hand. The man in front took it, not just a handshake, a grip that held. The kind between men who have been through something. "Decker," Caleb said. "Walker," the man said. Lillian's breath stopped somewhere in her chest. She walked out of the barn. She walked toward the yard. She was aware of 7 pairs of eyes shifting toward her as she crossed the distance, and she let them look. She had learned a long time ago that the worst thing you could do with a situation you didn't understand was pretend you weren't in it. She stopped beside Caleb. "My wife," Caleb said. "Lillian." Decker looked at her. He had dark eyes that were measuring, but not unkind. "Ma'am," he said. "Mr. Decker," she said. A pause. "I didn't know you'd married," Decker said to Caleb. "Recent," Caleb said. "You could have written." "I could have," Caleb agreed with the ghost of something that was almost humor. Decker looked between them. He said to Lillian, "He'd tell you about us." "Not yet," she said. Decker nodded slowly. "Fair enough," he said. He looked at Caleb. "We've got a situation. We needed to talk to someone we trust. Didn't have a lot of options." "Come inside," Caleb said. She made coffee, lots of it. The 7 men filled the main room in a way that should have felt threatening. The leather, the road smell, the sheer volume of people who were visibly capable of considerable violence and somehow didn't, which told Lillian something important about the company Caleb apparently kept. She sat at the kitchen table. She listened. She did not pretend she wasn't listening. What emerged over the next 2 hours was not the story she'd expected. The Hells Angels. This group, Decker's group, had operated in this part of the country for 12 years. They were not by any reasonable assessment choir boys. Decker himself had a history she didn't ask about, and he didn't offer. But the thing that mattered, the thing that had brought them to Broken Ridge on a Thursday in March, was that they were being threatened. A man named Victor Hale. Hale was a land developer, wealthy by a scale that made local wealth look like pocket change, and he had been moving through the territory for 2 years, buying land and water rights. Sometimes he bought them fairly. Often he didn't. When property owners refused to sell, things happened. Inspections that found violations that had previously gone unnoticed. Loans that were called in unexpectedly. Legal disputes that were expensive enough to force sales even when the underlying claim was questionable. Decker's group owned a piece of land outside of Billings. They'd owned it for 8 years. Victor Hale wanted it. They'd said no. 3 weeks later, 2 members of the group had been falsely arrested on weapons charges. The evidence had appeared from nowhere. The charges had disappeared equally fast once a certain amount of money changed hands, money the group had but shouldn't have had to spend. "He's testing us," Decker said, "seeing what we'll do when pushed." "And what will you do?" Caleb said. Decker's jaw was tight. "That depends on what we decide is smart." He looked at Caleb steadily. "I'm not here to start a war. I've got men with families. I want this handled right." A pause. "But I need to know what Hale's actually doing. Where his legal claims are weak. Whether there's a way to fight him on paper before we have to fight him any other way." Lillian looked up from her coffee. "Victor Hale," she said. Both men looked at her. "The land developer," she said. "He's been buying water rights in this county too." Caleb's eyes sharpened. "What?" "I found references to it in the county records. I was looking through land transfers from the last 3 years. It's part of what I was using to rebuild your property documentation, and there are 6 parcels in this valley that have transferred to a holding company called Meridian Land Partners." She paused. I didn't make the connection to Hale specifically until just now, but the pattern was unusual. A lot of acquisitions in a short period, several of them below assessed value. Decker was looking at her differently now. You have documentation, he said. I have the county records, she said. I can pull the pattern together in a day or two, maybe less if I know specifically what I'm looking for. A long silence. Decker looked at Caleb. You did good, he said, and it was clear he meant something broader than just the marriage. Caleb said nothing. But she felt him look at her briefly in that particular way, the one she still couldn't entirely read. Better-to-tig. Decker and his men made camp on the east field that night at Caleb's invitation, and over what Lillian suspected was the significant silent opinion of every nearby neighbor who would notice in the morning. She sat across from Caleb after the others had gone outside. Tell me about him, she said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. 6 years ago, he said, there was a man working this ranch, foreman, named Pruitt. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking. Pruitt was stealing from me, not the way Hendricks was stealing small amounts consistent. Pruitt was taking cattle, altering the sale records. I didn't know for almost 2 years. How did you find out? She asked. Decker, he said. His group was running through the county. One of his men saw a sale that didn't add up cattle with my brand being sold through a back channel in Billings. He told Decker. Decker came here and told me. He paused. He didn't have to. I was nobody to them. But he came and he told me, and when I confronted Pruitt and things got complicated, Decker's men were there. She processed that. Complicated how? Caleb looked at her steadily. Pruitt didn't leave quietly, he said. She didn't push further. She understood what that meant, or enough of it. So you owe him, she said. It's not about the debt, Caleb said. It's about the fact that he's a man who did the right thing when it cost him nothing to look the other way. That's a different category of person. Lillian looked at him. Yes, she said. It is. They sat for a moment. Victor Hale, she said. He's not going to stop at Decker's land. No, Caleb said. He's going to come for water rights in this valley, and the people who own them. Yes, Caleb said. A pause. Is that what the note on the east pasture is about? She said. Is Ted Callie in a position where Hale could pressure him? Caleb looked at her. She watched the expression on his face, the specific shift of a person recognizing that someone else has gotten to a conclusion faster than they expected. I need to look at those county records, he said. I'll pull them tomorrow, she said. Tonight, he said. She was already getting up. They worked until 2 in the morning. She pulled the records. He knew the land and the people who owned who held notes, who had been approached to sell and refused. She put the pattern together on paper. He filled in the names and histories that the paper didn't show. By midnight, they had a picture. Victor Hale, through Meridian Land Partners, and 2 other holding companies that Lillian traced through 3 different filing records, had acquired or held options on 11 parcels in the county. 8 of them contained water rights on the Miller Creek watershed. The remaining 3 sat on land that effectively controlled access to 2 of the valley's main roads. It was not random acquisition. It was strategic, methodical, the kind of plan that only made sense when you pulled it all the way back and looked at the shape of it. If he gets the watershed rights, Lillian said, he controls water access for every ranch in the upper valley. Including this one, Caleb said. Including this one, she confirmed. They looked at the map between them. He hasn't approached you, she said. It wasn't a question. Not yet, Caleb said. I wondered why. Because Broken Ridge is a linchpin, she said. Your property connects the eastern and western parcels. If he gets everything else first, then approaches you, the negotiating position is different. You'd be surrounded. Caleb's face was absolutely still. He's been waiting for the right moment, he said. Yes, she said. I think Decker's situation moved up the timeline. Something about the Billings property, maybe a permitting issue, maybe a deadline on a water filing, made Hale move faster than planned. And that's why Decker came here now. Because Hale is moving. Caleb sat back. He looked at her across the table, across the maps, the records, the 2 in the morning evidence of what they'd built together in this kitchen tonight. "What do you want to do?" he said. And that was the thing. Not what should we do, or here's what I've decided. What do you want to do? She picked up her pen. I want to document everything, she said. Every acquisition, every filing, every instance where the sale price was below market. I want to write to the state land office. I want to find out whether the holding companies were properly disclosed in the county filings, because if they weren't, there may be legal grounds to challenge the acquisitions entirely. She looked at him. And I want to find out who else in this valley doesn't know what's happening to them yet, she said. Because Hale is counting on people not talking to each other. Caleb held her gaze. That's going to make enemies, he said. It already has enemies, she said. The question is whether we're going to let that matter. He was quiet for a long moment. No, he said. Good, she said, and she went back to writing. The town found out within a week, as towns always do. Not from Lillian, not from Caleb. From the particular friction that occurs when 7 motorcycles are parked on someone's east field, and neighbors have eyes and no shortage of time to think about what they're seeing. The reaction was complicated and swift. 3 ranchers came to the gate wanting to talk. One of them was Ted Callie, which Caleb met with a calm that Lillian found privately impressive. 2 others were men whose names she'd seen in the county records, names attached to parcels Hale hadn't reached yet, which meant they needed to be told what was coming before it arrived. She sat in on those conversations. Caleb introduced her simply as his wife, and then let her speak when she had something to say, which she did with the maps and the documentation she'd assembled laid out on the kitchen table, or the tailgate of somebody's truck, or wherever the conversation was happening. People listened. Not all of them believed her. 2 of the 3 ranchers at the gate had their own suspicions about who she was and what she wanted, and she could feel those suspicions operating in the room even as they looked at the paperwork she was showing them. But the paperwork was the paperwork. Numbers didn't carry opinions about Lillian Whitmore. Vera Hutchins. When she heard that Caleb Walker's mysterious new wife was apparently organizing some kind of response to a land developer, reportedly said that Lillian was obviously angling to get her name attached to something important, and that people should be careful about following someone who'd arrived with nothing and seemed awfully eager to be involved in everything. Lillian heard about this on a Thursday. On Friday, she drove into Harlow, walked into the post office, and stood at the counter while Vera was sorting the morning mail. Vera looked up. She had the expression of someone who had been expecting this visit and had prepared for it. Lillian said, "Mrs. Hutchins, I know what you've been saying about me. I'm not going to ask you to stop because I can't make you, and because I think you believe it. But I want to say something to you one time, and then this conversation is over." Vera said nothing, her hand stilled on the mail. "I came to this valley with nothing," Lillian said. "That's true. I married Caleb Walker for reasons that were practical and honest, and I told him exactly what those reasons were before he agreed. What I've done at Broken Ridge since then I've done because it needed doing, and because I'm capable of doing it, and because it's the right thing to do, not to impress anyone, not to get my name attached to something." She paused. "Victor Hale is buying water rights in this valley. If he gets them, every ranch that depends on the Miller Creek watershed will be paying him for access to water they've had free right to for 30 years, including yours." Vera blinked. "Your husband's family has been here since 1880, Lillian said. "I looked it up. The Hutchins parcel sits on the east fork of Miller Creek. If you want to know what Victor Hale has planned for it, I have the documentation at the ranch. You're welcome to come and look at it." She turned. She walked out. She got back in the wagon and drove back to Broken Ridge. She did not know until Doris told her 3 days later that Vera Hutchins had shown up at the ranch the following morning. Caleb had let her in. Lillian had been out riding the fence line. When she came back, Vera was sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, looking at the land records with an expression that had rearranged itself significantly from the one it usually wore. "Mrs. Walker," Vera said, which was the first time anyone had called her that, and the strangeness of it landed somewhere unexpected. "Mrs. Hutchins?" Lillian said. A pause. "This is very thorough," Vera said, gesturing at the documentation. "It is," Lillian agreed. Another pause longer. "I may have been," Vera started. "You don't have to," Lillian said. Vera looked at her. "I may have been unfair," Vera said, completing it, like she needed to regardless. "All right," Lillian said. "What do you need?" Vera said. And something shifted in the room. Not reconciliation exactly, not warmth, but a kind of recognition of what the situation actually was, and who was actually capable of dealing with it. "I need people to talk to each other," Lillian said. "And I need them to not be afraid of looking like they trust a woman who married a cowboy out of desperation." Vera held her gaze. "I can do that," she said. That evening after Vera left, Caleb came into the kitchen and sat down across from Lillian. He said, "You know she's going to take credit for organizing people." "I know," Lillian said. "Doesn't that bother you?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "What I care about is the water rights. She can have the credit." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face. Something that had been building, she realized now, for weeks. Something she'd been catching at the edges of his expression in unguarded moments, and then looking away from, because looking directly at it felt like a territory she hadn't been given permission to enter. He didn't say whatever it was. He just looked at her. And then he said quietly, "Good night, Lillian." "Good night, Caleb," she said. He went upstairs. She sat at the table for a long time. Outside, the wind had picked up. A storm was coming in off the mountains. She could feel it in the air, the particular pressure shift that she'd been learning to read in these months on the ranch. She looked around the kitchen. The maps spread on the table. The records she'd assembled. The coffee cups from an evening that had gone from work into something she didn't have a clean word for. She looked at the staircase where he'd gone up. She thought about a chest with her name on it that she didn't yet know existed. She thought about 6 years that she didn't yet know about. She thought about, "I've thought about it." And, "She would have liked you." And, "Not anymore." And the blanket on the chair and the repaired saddle, and 100 small things that didn't add up to a coincidence if you looked at them honestly. She was trying very hard not to look at them honestly. Because if she looked at them honestly, she would have to ask the question she'd been avoiding since the first week in this house. Why not the simple why? Not the "yes because you came and were honest" version. The real why. She wasn't ready for the answer. Not yet. But the storm was coming, and she had learned in the months since October that the things you were not ready for had a way of arriving exactly when they intended to, regardless of your readiness. The wind pressed against the house. Somewhere behind the barn in the dark, a locked building stood in the cold. And inside it, a chest. And inside the chest, the answer to every question she hadn't asked yet. She just didn't know it. The storm hit on a Saturday night. It came in fast and mean, the way Montana storms do in March. No long warning, just a shift in the air pressure, and then suddenly everything was wind and ice, and the kind of dark that makes you feel like the world has closed down to just the 4 walls around you. Lillian had been working late. She was always working late now because the hail situation had expanded in ways that kept opening new rooms she hadn't known were there. New holding companies, new filings, a pattern of legal maneuvering that was sophisticated enough to require her full attention, and then some. Decker had left 2 of his men at the ranch to help with the physical work, while she and Caleb handled the documentation side, and the house had taken on the particular energy of a place preparing for something, rather than simply living through the ordinary days. She liked that energy, if she was honest. She had always been a person who did her best thinking when something real was at stake. Caleb had gone to bed an hour earlier. He was up before dawn every day, and he never apologized for the fact that late nights cost him, and she had stopped expecting him to stay up simply for the company. That was one of the things she had learned about him. He did not perform endurance. He knew his own limits, and he worked within them without drama. She was about to close the ledger and go upstairs when she heard it. A sound from outside. Not the wind, she knew. The wind by now knew its registers and rhythms against this house. This was different. A bang low and deliberate from the direction of the barn. She sat still for a moment. The barn was where Decker's two men were sleeping. One of them, a quiet, watchful man named Reyes, had mentioned that he was a light sleeper and would hear anything that moved on the property at night. So it was probably nothing. The sound came again. She pulled on her coat. She took the lamp from the table. She opened the back door into the wind and the cold. The yard was dark and loud with the storm. She moved toward the barn, head down, keeping the lamp close. She passed the barn. Reyes was awake in the doorway, watching her cross the yard. "Something back there?" he said, nodding past the barn. She looked. There was a structure she had noticed but never thought much about, a low building behind, and to the left of the main barn, older than the barn itself, with a door that had a heavy lock on it. She had assumed it was storage. She had never asked about it because there were always more pressing things to ask about. The bang came again. The door was moving in the wind. The latch was straining against something. She walked toward it. Reyes came with her, which she appreciated without saying so. The door was not fully latched. The storm had found the gap and was working it, pulling the door against its own lock. She put her hand on it to pull it shut. And then the lamp caught the inside of the door as it swung, and she saw what was in there. Not storage. A room. Small, but kept. A shelf along one wall. A wooden chest on the floor, large and old, the kind of chest that held something important rather than something merely useful. And her name, carved into the front of the chest, Lillian. She stood very still. The wind tore around her. Reyes said something she didn't hear. She stepped inside. She crouched in front of the chest. She touched the letters with 2 fingers. The carving was old, not recent. The wood around it had weathered. This had not been made for her arrival. This had been here for a long time. Her hands were not entirely steady when she found that the chest was not locked. She opened it. Letters. Dozens of them. Each one folded, each one dated. She picked up the one on top, moved the lamp close, and read the date. 6 years ago. March 15th. 6 years ago. She unfolded it. The handwriting was Caleb's. She knew it by now from the notes he sometimes left on the kitchen table, from the records he'd written, in that careful, deliberate hand that matched everything else about him. She started reading. "I don't know why I'm writing this. I don't send letters, I write. I never have. But I need to put it somewhere, and paper holds things that I can't hold myself. I saw her today at the grain auction. She was arguing with the weighing man about a measurement that was off by 4 pounds. 4 pounds. She had the receipt, and she knew exactly what it should have read, and she stood there until he corrected it. She wasn't rude about it. She was just certain. I don't think she noticed me. I don't think she remembers my name. We were introduced once 2 years ago, and she had her mind on something else. I have thought about her every day since that introduction. I don't have a reasonable explanation for it. I just know that when I see her, something settles in me, like a compass finding north." Lillian sat down on the floor of that little building in the howling storm. She picked up another letter, and another. Say, she read for a long time. She lost track of the wind. She lost track of the cold, even though she was sitting on a wood floor in a coat that wasn't quite enough for March in Montana. She lost track of everything except the letters and what they contained. They were not love letters in the formal sense. They were not flowery or theatrical or trying to be anything they weren't. They were simply true. Written by a man who was putting things down on paper because he had nowhere else to put them, in a voice that was exactly the voice she knew from the kitchen table, and the supper conversations, and the quiet hours of working side by side. A letter from 4 years ago after her mother's funeral. He had been there standing near the back, and she hadn't known. She didn't cry during the service. I watched her hold herself together for 2 straight hours. And then afterward, in the church hall, she took a plate of food to old Henry Marsh, because he was sitting alone and clearly hadn't eaten. She was grieving, and she still looked around the room to see who needed something. That's who she is. That's the whole of it. She carries herself, and she carries the people around her, and she doesn't make a production of either. A letter from 3 years ago, after a bad winter, had taken the Whitmore cattle. George Whitmore's losses are all over the valley this week. People are talking about it the way people talk about other people's misfortune, sad about it, but also somehow distant. I went by the farm. I didn't stop. I didn't have a reason to stop. But I slowed down when I passed. I could see a light in the kitchen window, just one light, and I thought she's still there, working, not giving up. I wanted to knock on that door. I didn't. I don't know what I would have said. A letter from 18 months ago. The one that made her breath stop entirely. She sold the good furniture today. I was in town, and I saw the man loading it onto his cart outside her rented room. She walked out, and she watched them take it, and she didn't look away. She didn't pretend it wasn't happening. She just watched until it was gone, and then she went back inside. I thought about how many things she's watched leave. The cattle, the farm, now the furniture. I thought about going to her, telling her something. I don't know what. That she doesn't have to do this alone. I didn't go, because she didn't choose me. She's never chosen me. She doesn't even know me, not really. You don't go to someone and offer yourself as a solution when they haven't asked and when they've given you no reason to think they'd want you. So I didn't go. But God, I wanted to. And the last one. The one on top, the most recent, dated 9 days before she knocked on his door. I heard she was given notice at the boarding house. I heard she's been trying to find work in 3 counties and hasn't found it. I heard she's nearly out of options. I've thought every night this week about whether I should go to her, make some kind of offer. Something practical, something she could say yes or no to without obligation. But I keep stopping myself, because it has to be her choice. Whatever happens, it has to be her. If she comes to me, she comes to me. If she doesn't, if she finds another way, a better way, then that's what's right. I'll leave the door unlocked. Lillian stopped reading. She sat very still in that little building with the wind screaming outside and the lamp burning low. He had left the door unlocked, not metaphorically. She thought about the front door of this house the first morning she had stood on those steps and knocked. He had opened the door within 30 seconds. Because he heard her coming up the road. He had been awake. He had been waiting. I've thought about it, he'd said. 6 years. Not waiting in the way of obsession or possession. None of these letters had that texture. They were not the letters of a man who thought he owned something. They were the letters of a man who had seen something extraordinary and had chosen over and over again not to take it, to let it be free to wait for it to come of its own choice, even if it never came at all. She pressed her hand flat against the letters. Her chest hurt, not in a bad way, in the specific way of something that has been locked up for a long time being opened. She thought about the blanket on the chair, the repaired saddle, the "she would have liked you," the "not anymore," when she asked if he regretted not going to California. She sat there for a long moment, and then she stood up, and she walked back to the house. She didn't go upstairs. She sat at the kitchen table, and she stared at the wall, and she tried to think clearly, which was not easy, because the thing that had arrived in her chest when she read those letters was not interested in clarity. She had come to this man out of desperation. She had laid her situation flat on his kitchen table, with the honesty of someone who has no pride left to protect. She had proposed a practical arrangement. She had been careful from the very first day to be useful and not indebted, to give as much as she received, to make sure this was a fair exchange. And underneath all of it, the entire time there had been 6 years of letters in a locked building behind the barn. 6 years of a man watching from a careful distance, wanting something, refusing to reach for it, because reaching for it would mean taking away her choice. She thought about that. about what it meant to love someone that carefully, to want something that badly, and to hold yourself back from it repeatedly for years, because the wanting was less important than the other person's freedom. She had known men who called that kind of restraint weakness. She was not sure she had ever known a man who understood that it was actually the hardest kind of strength there was. Her hands were flat on the table. She was looking at nothing. The clock on the wall said 2 in the morning. She should sleep. She did not sleep. She was still sitting there when she heard him on the stairs. He came down quietly the way he always did and stopped when he saw the kitchen light still on. He looked at her. She looked at him. He was in a work shirt, half-dressed the way a person looks when they've woken and come down without thinking. His hair was not neat. He looked briefly like a person rather than the composed and careful version he presented during the day, and she registered that. "You're up late," he said. "I couldn't sleep," she said. He looked at her more carefully. He was a man who paid attention, and whatever he read in her face right now was enough to make him stay in the doorway rather than head for the coffee. "What's wrong?" he said. She looked at him. "I went outside," she said. During the storm, there was a sound from behind the barn. His expression changed. Something moved through it fast and then gone. But she saw it. "The door was open," she said. "The storm had caught the latch." Silence. "I went inside," she said. He said nothing. "There's a chest in there," she said, "with my name on it." The silence that followed was the longest one she'd ever sat inside. She could hear the clock. She could hear the storm slightly quieter now moving past them. She could hear her own breathing, and she thought possibly his. He moved. He came to the table. He sat down in the chair across from her, the one he always sat in, the one that was his, in the unspoken way that chairs in shared houses become someone's without anyone deciding it. He put his hands on the table. He looked at them. "How many did you read?" he said. "Enough," she said. He nodded once, and she could see that he was assembling himself, the particular assembly of a private person who has been found out. Not guilty, not performative, just arranging himself for the exposure that had arrived. "I wasn't hiding them from you," he said. "I don't know how to explain that, but I wasn't." "Then what were you doing?" she said. "Keeping them," he said. "Because I didn't know what to do with them. You can't send a letter to someone who doesn't know you're writing to them." He paused. "I couldn't throw them away either." She looked at him. 6 years, she said. "Yes." "You watched me for 6 years." "No?" he said, and his voice was careful. "I noticed you. There's a difference. I didn't follow you. I didn't involve myself in your life. I saw you sometimes when we were in the same place. And I wrote about what I saw because—" He stopped. "Because that's what I do with things I can't say out loud." Lillian sat with that. "You wrote about the day my mother died," she said. His jaw tightened slightly. "You were there," she said. "At the church hall. You saw me take a plate to Henry Marsh." "Yes," he said. "I didn't see you." "I know. Why didn't you speak to me?" He looked up at her. His eyes were steady, dark and steady. "Because you were grieving," he said. "What was I going to say? I barely knew you. I had no right to your grief." She absorbed that. "The last letter," she said. "You said you'd leave the door unlocked." "Yes," he said. "You meant the actual door." "Yes." "You were awake when I came." "Yes." She looked at him. She was trying to locate the right question inside everything she wanted to ask, and finding it difficult because they were all arriving at once. "Why didn't you ever come to me?" she said. "Not the grief, not the individual moments. All of it. 6 years of it. Why didn't you ever say something? Come to the farm. Give me a reason to know you existed." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, it was a carefully, not the rehearsed careful of someone who'd planned this conversation, the careful of someone choosing words for something real. "Because you never looked for me," he said. "And I didn't want to be something that happened to you. I wanted—" He stopped. Started again. If you came to me, I wanted it to be because you chose to. Not because I'd put myself in your path and made it convenient. Not because I'd arranged a situation where it felt like the logical next step. He looked at her steadily. You have enough people in your life who've made choices for you. I didn't want to be one more. The clock ticked. Outside, the storm was quieting. Lillian felt something move through her that she didn't have a clean word for, not quite emotion and not quite thought, but the specific sensation of understanding something that rearranges how you've been seeing a very large thing. You could have waited forever, she said. I know, he said. I might never have come. I know that too. And you were prepared for that. He held her gaze. It would have been difficult, he said. But yes, it had to be your choice. The whole of it had to be yours, or it didn't mean anything. Lillian put her hands flat on the table. She looked at them. She said, I came to you because I had no options left. I know why you came, he said. That's not a love story, she said. That's desperation. That's Lillian. His voice was quiet, but it stopped her. Why you came is not the same as what happened after you arrived. She looked up. I know what you came here for, he said. You told me. Honestly. In this kitchen on a January afternoon, and I said yes, because I'd been hoping for 6 years that you'd come. And when you did, and when you were exactly who I'd spent 6 years believing you were honest and unafraid and not asking me for anything except a fair arrangement, I said yes. He paused. What's happened in this house since that afternoon, he said, is not the desperation you arrived with. You know that. She did know it. That was the thing. She knew it. She had known it for a while now, in the way you know things you're not ready to look at directly. I don't know what to do with this, she said. You don't have to do anything with it tonight, he said. I found a chest with my name on it in the middle of a snowstorm, she said. That's not nothing. No, he agreed. It's not nothing. She looked at him. Were you ever going to tell me? She said. He was quiet for a moment. If we'd been married 20 years, he said, and you'd never found it. No, I would have let it be. He paused. I'm not sure that was right, but it wasn't about hiding it from you. It was about... He searched. You came here for a roof and a fair arrangement. I didn't want to put 6 years of... He gestured briefly, that on top of what you were already carrying. You thought it would be a burden, she said. I thought it might feel like a debt, he said. And you've been very clear about not wanting to be in debt to anyone. She stared at him. Because that was precisely accurate. She had been clear about that. Explicitly, in so many words. And he had heard it and taken it seriously enough to lock 6 years of himself behind a door and not mention it. Caleb, she said. Yes, he said. She didn't have what came next. She sat there with her hands on the table, and this man across from her in the 2 a.m. quiet of their kitchen, and she was empty of the right words. She had been organized and articulate and purposeful for months with the records with the Hale documentation with Vera Hutchins at the post office, and now she had nothing. I need to sleep, she said. Yes, he said. This conversation is not over. I know. She stood. She pushed in her chair. She stopped at the doorway of the kitchen and turned. Caleb? He looked at her. The letter about my mother's funeral, she said. The part where you wrote that she would have liked me. She paused. You've said that to me. Recently. You said she would have liked you. His face was very still. It was true then, he said. It's true now. She nodded. She went upstairs. She lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep for a long time. And when sleep finally came, it came like the end of the storm outside, not with any announcement, just a gradual quiet, replacing the noise that had been there before. Morning came hard and bright the way it does after a storm, all the world washed clean and the air cut sharp. She came downstairs and he was already up, already had coffee on, already was sitting at the table with his own cup and a set of papers he wasn't really reading. He looked up when she came in. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he said. She poured coffee. She sat down. She wrapped her hands around the cup. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want an honest answer." "All right," he said. "Do you love me?" she said. No preamble, no softening. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, just that. The same way he'd said yes on the day she proposed immediate certain no deliberation. She nodded. She drank her coffee. "I don't know yet what I feel," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I think you deserve clarity." "I know," he said. "I'm not going to pretend I know what this is between us when I don't fully know yet," she said. "That wouldn't be honest, and I don't, Lillian." His voice was calm. "You don't owe me a feeling. You know that." She looked at him. "I know," she said. She drank her coffee. "But I'm not pretending that I don't feel something," she added quietly to the cup. The kitchen was very quiet. She heard his breath shift slightly. "Okay," he said, carefully, as if he was being very deliberate about how he held it. "I'm going to go work," she said. "I have 3 more holding companies to trace today, and I want to have everything ready for the county filing by Thursday." "I'll be in the North Pasture," he said. "Back by noon." "All right," she said. She stood. She paused. "Caleb?" "Yes." "The chest." She turned. "Can I keep the letters?" Something in his face moved in a way she'd never seen before. Not quite undone. He was not a man who came undone easily. But close to it. The edges of it. "They're already yours," he said. "They always were." She nodded. She went to work. The world did not stop for the discovery of 6 years of letters. That was something Lillian would remember afterward, how life maintains its forward motion, regardless of what is turning over inside you. The Hale situation did not pause because she'd had a night that rearranged something fundamental. Decker's men were still in the East Field. The county filing needed to be ready by Thursday. 3 ranchers in the valley were depending on the documentation she was compiling to understand what was coming for their land and their water. She worked. She worked hard and focused the way she always did when she needed to put her hands on something real. But underneath the work, something was moving. Something had been released from the pressure of not knowing, and now it was moving through the days differently. She noticed things she'd been not noticing for weeks. The way he handed her coffee in the morning, he had learned exactly how she took it without asking. The way he angled his chair at the table slightly toward her when they were working side by side. The way he always heard her on the stairs before she reached the bottom. Not because he was watching for her, but because he was simply always alert to where she was. She noticed the way Decker's man Reyes watched the 2 of them in the kitchen one afternoon, and then said very quietly to the other man, Briggs, something she wasn't supposed to hear but did. Walker's had it bad for a long time. Good that she came. She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Good that she came. As if it was simply known. As if everyone who knew Caleb Walker had simply known and had been waiting and were now watching with the quiet satisfaction of people who had been patient about someone else's important thing. She went to Decker that evening. He was outside working on one of the motorcycles. She stood nearby until he noticed her. "How long have you known him?" she asked. 6 years, Decker said, "since the Pruitt situation." "Did he ever mention me?" she said. Decker looked at her with the particular expression of a man deciding how honest to be. "Once," he said. "About 4 years ago. We were passing through and stopped at the ranch. Had supper. Afterward," he paused. "There was a woman in the next town who was interested in him. I said something about it. The way you do." He picked up a wrench. He just shook his head, said there was someone he was thinking about. He looked at Lillian directly. I assumed she must be something if it was her instead of a woman right in front of him. Lillian said nothing. "She was," Decker said simply, and went back to the motorcycle. She was in the middle of reviewing the Meridian Land Partners filing records on Wednesday afternoon when Caleb came in from outside, moving faster than usual. She looked up. "Hale's in town," he said. The room sharpened. "Since when?" "Hour ago. He came into the county clerk's office." Caleb's jaw was set. "He filed a motion to contest the Briggs parcel transfer. Claims a prior right." She stood up. "He doesn't have one," she said. "I've been through every filing in this county for 30 years. There is no prior right on the Briggs parcel." "I know that," Caleb said. "But if he files the motion, it ties up the parcel in dispute status for months. And while it's in dispute, the Briggs family can't transfer. It can't get financing against it and will be paying a lawyer they can't afford to defend a claim that shouldn't exist," she said. "Yes," he said. She was already moving to the records table. "He's doing it to put pressure," she said, pulling files. "He doesn't expect to win the motion. He expects the cost of defending it to be enough to make them sell." "Yes," Caleb said again, and there was something in his voice that was carefully controlled anger. The kind that doesn't raise itself because raising it would cost focus. She pulled the county record on the Briggs parcel. She laid it on the table. She found the original deed transfer and the subsequent filing and the survey records that accompanied them. "He's counting on people not having their documentation in order," she said, more to herself than to him. "He's counting on incomplete records and people who are too tired and too scared to fight." She looked up. "He hasn't counted on me," she said. Caleb looked at her, and for the first time in the full light of a Wednesday afternoon, with the crisis arrived and the work about to begin, she saw his face completely unguarded, all the steadiness and all the warmth and 6 years of it right there, not hidden at all. "No," he said. "He hasn't." She put her pen to the paper. "Get Decker," she said. "I'm going to need him to contact the Billings Records office by tomorrow morning. And I need you to write out to the Briggs place and tell them not to sign anything, talk to anyone from Meridian, or respond to any communication from Hale's lawyers until I've had a chance to look at the motion." "I'm going," he said. He was already at the door. "Caleb," she said. He stopped. She looked at him across the kitchen, across the table, with the maps and the records across the months they'd lived in this house, across everything she'd found in that chest, and everything she still hadn't said. "Be careful," she said. He held her gaze. "Always," he said. And then he was gone, and Lillian Whitmore, Lillian Walker. She reminded herself, because she was going to need every piece of legal standing she had in the days ahead, sat down at the table and got to work. Because Victor Hale had arrived, and he had no idea what was waiting for him. Victor Hale came to Broken Ridge on a Friday morning. And he came the way men like him always come, unannounced, unhurried, with the particular ease of someone who believes the outcome of a conversation is already settled before it begins. Lillian heard the car before she saw it. A good car, expensive, not the kind of vehicle that belonged on a ranch road in early spring. She was at the kitchen table with the Briggs parcel documents spread out in front of her and 3 days of almost no sleep behind her. And when she looked out and saw the man stepping out of that car in a coat that cost more than her father's farm had been worth, at its best she felt something clarify inside her, not anger, sharper than anger, focus. She stood up. She straightened her papers. She went to the door before he had a chance to knock. He was younger than she'd expected. Mid-40s, well-built, with a face that had learned to present pleasantness as its default expression, while the eyes behind it did the actual calculating. He looked at her with the specific assessment of a man who has decided in advance that the woman answering the door is not the relevant party. "Mrs. Walker," he said warmly. "Is your husband home? He'll be back within the hour," she said. "I'm happy to speak with you in the meantime." A slight pause. The recalibration of a man adjusting to an inconvenience. "Victor Hale," he said, offering his hand. "I know who you are," she said. She shook his hand briefly. "Come in." She brought him to the kitchen table. She did not offer coffee. She sat across from him with her hands folded on top of the documents, and she looked at him with exactly as much pleasantness as he had earned, which was none. "I want to be straightforward with you, Mr. Hale," she said. which was how she had begun the most important conversations of the last 4 months, and which still worked because it was still true. I know about Meridian Land Partners. I know about the two other holding companies, Cascade Resource Group and Western Basin Holdings. I know about the 11 parcel acquisitions in this county over the past 26 months. I know about the Briggs motion you filed Wednesday and the reason you filed it. Hale's pleasant expression didn't move. You've been doing research, he said. I have, she said. I've also sent a complete documentation package to the State Land Office, a copy to the county assessor, and a copy to a lawyer in Helena who specializes in water rights litigation. She paused. I want you to understand that before this conversation goes further, something shifted behind his eyes. Not panic, not yet, but an adjustment. The adjustment of a man who had come expecting a negotiation and is now receiving different information about what kind of meeting this is. Mrs. Walker, he said, and his voice had found a new register, not warm, but careful. I'm not sure what you think you've found, but my business dealings in this county are entirely legal and properly documented. Some of them are, she said. The Parsons parcel acquisition is clean. So is the Kellerman transfer. 3 others are questionable in ways that would require extended litigation to resolve, which I think was intentional. You're betting that people won't want to pay for the fight. She held his gaze. But the holding company structure itself is the problem, Mr. Hale. Montana state law requires disclosure of beneficial ownership in land acquisitions above a certain threshold. You structured 3 of your purchases through Cascade specifically to fall below that threshold on paper, while the combined acquisition exceeded it. That's not a gray area. That's a filing violation. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the ones before it. That's a significant claim, Hale said. I have significant documentation, she said. He studied her. She let him. What is it you want? He said. I want you to withdraw the Briggs motion by end of business today, she said. I want written confirmation that Meridian Land Partners will not pursue any further acquisition or option on parcels in the Miller Creek watershed. And I want the 2 ranch workers your people intimidated last month to receive a written apology from your organization. He stared at her. The ranch workers, he said. Ed Norris and Carl Whitfield, she said. Both employed by the Lester Ranch. Both approached by men associated with your operation and told that the Lester property would be, and I'm quoting here, difficult to hold on to if Frank Lester didn't reconsider his position on selling. She paused. I have written statements from both of them. Hale put his hands flat on the table. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked up. You're a very organized woman, he said. Yes, she agreed. Who helped you with this? He said. This is not something someone puts together in a few weeks without. I put it together myself, she said. I'm a ranch manager and accountant with access to county records and a significant amount of motivation. She looked at him evenly. You underestimated what was happening on this property, Mr. Hale. That's not my fault. He was quiet for a long moment. She heard the sound of horses in the yard. Caleb was back. She heard shortly after the particular sound of motorcycles Decker and his men who had ridden out at first light and come back through town, and who had timed their return, she strongly suspected to coincide with this meeting. Hale heard it too. He looked toward the window. The Hells Angels, he said, and his voice was careful in the way of a man doing a rapid assessment. Friends of the family, she said. Caleb came through the door. He stopped when he saw Hale. He looked at Lillian, a brief look that asked the question. She gave a small nod that answered it under control. Let me finish. He stood near the door. He did not sit. He did not need to. Decker came in behind him. He did not speak. He simply stood there, the full weight of his presence, doing what it had always done, without any assistance from words. Hale looked at the room, at the documents on the table, at Caleb by the door, at Decker, at Lillian, who had not moved or changed expression. I'll need time to speak with my lawyer, Hale said. You have until 5 o'clock today on the Briggs motion, she said. The rest I can give you until Monday, But I want it in writing, and I want it filed before close of business Monday, or the documentation package I sent to Helena gets followed up by a formal complaint with the Attorney General's office." Another silence. "That's a very aggressive position for someone who—" he started. "For someone who what?" she said. Quietly, not aggressively, just asking. He stopped. She watched him recalculate one final time. Watched him run through the options, the way she'd run through them herself, over 3 days of documentation, and arrive at the same conclusion she had arrived at, that the easiest path, the one that cost him the least in time, and legal exposure, and public attention, was the one she was offering him right now. "I'll speak with my lawyer," he said again, and this time, it was not a resistance, but a concession. "That's fine," she said. "I'll walk you out." "We're done." She walked him to his car. He said very little. He was a man who had done a great deal of thinking in the past 20 minutes and was not finished with it yet. Before he got in, he turned to her. "You're not from old money," he said. "You're not connected. You came from nowhere with nothing." It was not an insult exactly. It was more like a man trying to understand a variable that hadn't fit his model. "How did you know where to look?" She looked at him. "I spent 4 months being desperate," she said. When you're desperate, you learn very quickly which documentation matters and which doesn't, which records people forget to check, and which ones tell the whole story. She paused. "You've been counting on people being too scared or too tired or too poor to dig. I wasn't any of those things, not anymore." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he got in his car and drove away. She stood in the yard until the car was gone. Then she turned around. Caleb was on the porch steps. Decker was beside him. Both of them were looking at her with expressions that were different versions of the same thing. "Well," Decker said. "Don't," she said, walking toward them. "I wasn't going to say anything," Decker said in the voice of a man who absolutely was going to say something. "He'll withdraw the motion," she said to Caleb. "Yes," Caleb said. "He will." She climbed the steps. She was tired in a way that had gone past the ordinary kind into something that sat behind her eyes and in her shoulders and probably wouldn't lift for a week. "I need coffee," she said. "I'll make it," Caleb said. Hale withdrew the Briggs motion at 4:15 that afternoon. The written commitment on the watershed acquisitions came through on Monday, 20 minutes before her deadline drafted, in the careful language of lawyers who had reviewed the documentation she'd sent to Helena and advised their client strongly toward resolution rather than litigation. The apology to Ed Norris and Carl Whitfield came Thursday. Lillian read it carefully before she handed it to Frank Lester to pass along. It was more specific than she'd expected, more concrete in its acknowledgement of what had actually happened. She thought Hale's lawyers had probably insisted on specificity as legal protection, which was fine. It said what it needed to say. Ted Callie came by the ranch on Friday. He sat at the kitchen table, which was becoming, she had noticed, something of a center of gravity for people in the valley. This kitchen with its maps and records and always burning lamp. And he looked at the documentation she'd compiled, and he was quiet for a long time. "I had no idea," he said finally. "Most people didn't," she said. "That was the design." He looked at her. "I said some things," he said, "early on, about you and about why you were here. I want to—" "Mr. Callie," she said, "what matters right now is the East Pasture note and whether it needs restructuring to protect you from a similar approach in the future. Can we talk about that?" He blinked. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said. "Let's talk about that." Afterward, when he left, Caleb came in from outside and poured himself coffee and stood leaning against the counter. "He apologized," Caleb said. "Started to," she said. "You stopped him. I needed him focused," she said. "Apologies can come later. Documentation doesn't wait." Caleb looked at her with that look, the one she now knew the full history of 6 years of it, and still couldn't quite meet for longer than a few seconds without feeling something shift in her chest. "Lillian," he said. "I know," she said. She wasn't sure what she knew exactly, but she said it anyway because it felt true. "No?" he said. "I mean, you should know." What you did this week." He stopped. He set the coffee down. He was working for the words in the way he sometimes did not because he lacked them, but because he wanted the right ones. "I have run this ranch for 12 years. I have fought for it through drought and bad markets, and a foreman who stole from me for 2 years. I know this land." He paused. "But I would have lost it. Without what you did. Without how you think and organize and refuse to be afraid of the people who are supposed to be intimidating." He met her eyes. "I need you to know that I know that." She looked at him. "We did it together," she said. "No," he said. "You led it. I helped. There's a difference, and you taught me that difference the day you told me about the Marcus Greer contract, and I said you'd only been here a month." He paused. "You were right then. I was right to listen." She stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there for a moment with the familiar posture of someone trying to hold something large. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the letters." He went very still. "I've been thinking about what it means," she said, "to spend 6 years. She stopped. "Started differently. I lost everything in 4 months. My father, the farm, the furniture, the room in town, every next thing I'd planned. And in 4 months, I became a person I didn't recognize, someone who rode to a stranger's house and proposed a practical marriage because I had no other choice." She turned. "You spent 6 years building something," she said. "Not for me because I didn't know, but because of me. 6 years of paying attention, of writing it down, of waiting because you decided that waiting was what respect required." He didn't move. He was watching her the way he always watched important things, completely without distraction. "I want to tell you something honestly," she said, "because honest is the only way I know how to do any of this." "I know," he said. "What I feel for you," she said, "is not what I arrived here with. What I arrived here with was gratitude and relief and the particular warmth of a person who has been cold for a long time, being somewhere safe. I knew that. I was careful about it. I didn't want to mistake one thing for another." She took a breath. "But what I feel now," she said, "is not that." She held his gaze. "I don't have a clean name for it yet, but it is not gratitude. It is not relief." She paused. "It is something that was not there in January and is here now. And I think you deserve to know that." The kitchen was entirely quiet. He crossed it in 3 steps. He stood in front of her close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes, and he said very quietly, "Can I?" "Yes," she said. He put his hands on either side of her face gently, with the same care he put into everything he did, and he pressed his forehead to hers, and they stood like that for a moment. Not a kiss. Not yet just contact. Just the specific relief of 2 people who have been circling something for months and have finally stopped moving. "I've wanted to do that since January," he said. "I know," she said. "You knew," he said. "I'm very observant," she said. "I've been telling people that for months." He laughed. Actual laughter surprised out of him. She felt it against her forehead, and it was the best thing she'd heard in a very long time. "Caleb," she said. "Yes," he said. "Don't let me go yet," she said. "No," he said. "I won't." 1. The town found out, as the town always does in the way of places where news travels on its own schedule and arrives everywhere at once. What they found out was this: Victor Hale was gone. The Briggs parcel was clear. The watershed acquisitions had been abandoned. Ed Norris and Carl Whitfield had received a written apology from a land developer, which was the kind of thing nobody in the valley had believed they would ever see. And Lillian Walker, who had arrived in January with a broken horse and $4.30 and a folded piece of paper with her husband's name on it, had been the one who made it happen. Vera Hutchins said so at the post office. She said it with the particular energy of a woman who has repositioned herself on a topic and intends for everyone to understand that her current position is the considered one. Doris Faherty came by the ranch to deliver the news of Vera's conversion in person because some things needed to be delivered in person. She's telling everyone it was a community effort. Doris reported sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, and that she was involved from the early stages. She was, Lillian said. She helped get people talking. Doris looked at her. You're being generous. I'm being accurate, Lillian said. She came and looked at the documentation when I asked her to. That mattered. Doris shook her head slowly. You are a particular kind of person, she said, for the second time. You keep saying that, Lillian said. It keeps being true, Doris said. After Doris left, Caleb came in from the barn and poured coffee and sat down and said, Vera Hutchins is taking credit for the Hale situation. Partially, Lillian said. And you're fine with that. I am, she said. Why? She looked at him. Because 6 months ago, I was the woman who rode to a stranger's door with nothing, she said. And now, I'm the woman who dismantled a land developer's operation in a Montana county. Vera Hutchins can say whatever she wants. I know what I did. He looked at her. So do I, he said. She drank her coffee. Outside in the yard in the bright spring morning, everything was ordinary and everything was different. And she was sitting across from the man who had written her name on a chest 6 years before she ever knocked on his door, and she was home. Not because she'd arrived with nothing, because she'd built something from it. That was the difference. That was the whole of it. Spring came to Broken Ridge the way it always does in Montana, not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm day followed by 3 cold ones. Mud that froze overnight and thawed by noon. The particular stubbornness of a season that hasn't fully decided yet, and the particular stubbornness of the people who live through it, and work through it, and don't stop because the weather can't make up its mind. Lillian had stopped counting the weeks. She wasn't sure exactly when that happened, when the mental tally of how long have I been here had simply dissolved into this is where I am. But it had happened. And she noticed its absence, the way you notice the absence of a sound you'd grown accustomed to, a clock that stopped ticking somewhere in the house. She was working the cattle records one morning in late April when Caleb came in from the north pasture earlier than expected. She heard his boots on the porch, and she knew by the sound she knew all his sounds, now the rhythm of his movement in this house, the way you learn any language that matters, that something had happened. He came through the door and said, Marcus Greer is here. She looked up. He drove out himself, Caleb said. Not his man. Him. She stood. She understood the significance without needing it explained. Marcus Greer, the buyer with the 10-year relationship and the below-market rate they'd renegotiated 3 months ago, did not drive out to ranches himself. He had people for that. When Marcus Greer appeared in person, it meant the thing he needed to say was the kind of thing he needed to say face to face. Good or bad, she said. I don't know yet, Caleb said. He asked for both of us. She straightened her papers. She followed him out. Marcus Greer was a compact man in his 60s with a rancher's hands and a businessman's eyes, and he was standing in the yard with his hat in his hands, in the posture of someone who had rehearsed what they came to say and was now standing in the reality of having to say it. He looked at Lillian first. Mrs. Walker, he said. I owe you an apology. She waited. When Caleb told me you'd renegotiated the contract rate, he said, I'll be honest with you, I was insulted. I've known this ranch for 10 years. I sent men when Caleb broke his leg. I considered myself someone who dealt fairly. He paused. Then I checked the market rates myself, going back 3 years. He stopped again. You were right. And I was benefiting from a man who trusted me enough not to check. Lillian said nothing. I came to offer a retroactive adjustment, Greer said. For the last 3 years. It's not the full amount. My lawyer says I'm not legally required to do anything, but it's what I think is right. He looked at Caleb. I should have been the one keeping it fair, not you catching me at it. Caleb was quiet for a moment. I know you didn't mean it, Caleb said finally. That doesn't make it better, Greer said. No, Caleb agreed. But it changes what it is. Greer looked at Lillian again, directly. in the way of a man completing something. "You could have made this ugly," he said. "You had enough to make it very ugly." "I didn't want ugly," she said. "I wanted fair." He nodded slowly. "I'm going to tell you something," he said. "About the valley. About what people are saying." He turned his hat in his hands. 6 months ago, the word on Lillian Walker, on who you were, why you came here, what you were after, was not kind. I won't pretend otherwise." He looked at her steadily. "Today, there is not a rancher in this county who would say a word against you. Not after Hale, not after the Briggs parcel, not after what you put together." He paused. "I've been doing business in this valley for 30 years, Mrs. Walker. I've seen people come and try to earn their place here. I have never seen anyone do it the way you did." The yard was quiet. "Thank you, Mr. Greer," she said. He put his hat back on. He shook Caleb's hand. He looked at the two of them together for a moment, at whatever it was that existed between them, now visible enough, apparently, that a 60-year-old cattle buyer standing in a ranch yard in April could see it clearly. "Good," he said simply, as if confirming something. He got in his truck and drove away. That evening, Caleb made dinner. He did this sometimes now, had started doing it around the time the Hale situation resolved, not because she'd asked, and not because there was a discussion about it, simply because it was a thing that needed doing, and he had noticed she was tired, and he acted on what he noticed. That was who he was. She had stopped being surprised by it. She sat at the table and she watched him, and she thought about Marcus Greer saying, "I have never seen anyone do it the way you did," and she thought about the woman who had ridden through the January cold with $4.30 and a broken horse and a name on a folded piece of paper. She thought about how those two women were the same woman. She thought about how she had not known when she was the first one that she would become the second one. She had not ridden toward Broken Ridge with a plan to save it. She had ridden toward it because she had run out of everywhere else to go. That was the thing nobody outside this house fully understood. The people in the valley saw what she'd done, and they built a story around it, a story of a capable woman who had arrived with a strategy and executed it. They needed that story. It was tidier than the truth. The truth was that she had been drowning in January. The truth was that she had knocked on Caleb Walker's door because it was the last door she had left. The truth was that everything she had built here, every record organized and fraud uncovered and legal filing prepared, had grown out of simple desperation, transformed day by day, week by week, into something she chose because she wanted to choose it, not because she had no other choice. That transformation was the story. That was what mattered. "You're thinking loudly," Caleb said, not turning from the stove. "Can you hear me thinking from over there?" she said. "Your face does a specific thing," he said. "What thing?" "Like you're cross-examining yourself," he said. She almost smiled. "I was thinking about Marcus Greer." "What about him?" "He said he's never seen anyone earn their place the way I did," she said. "And I was thinking I didn't come here to earn a place. I came here to survive the winter." Caleb brought 2 plates to the table. He sat down. "And now," he said. She looked at him. "Now I can't imagine leaving," she said. And then, because she had always believed in saying the true thing directly, "And that's not about the ranch, or the work, or what we built with the Hale situation." He held her gaze. "I know what it's about," he said. "I know you do," she said. "I wanted to say it out loud anyway, because you've been very patient and you've said things when I needed them and waited when I needed that, and I want you to know that I—" She stopped finding the exact words, refusing to use approximate ones. "I love you," she said. "I don't know when it happened, but it happened. And I'm certain about it in the same way I'm certain about documentation. I checked it from every angle before I said it." The kitchen was entirely still. He looked at her across the table, across the food getting cold between them, and something moved through his face that was not like any expression she had seen before. Not the careful steadiness, not the warmth she'd learned to read at the edges of him. This was something without a layer over it. 6 years, he said quietly. And you say it like that. Like it's a fact you've verified. It is, she said. Lillian. Caleb. I have loved you, he said, for a very long time. In ways that cost me nothing because you didn't know, and it was easy to love someone quietly. And then you arrived in this house, and it started costing me every single day because you were right here, and you were everything I'd thought you were, and more, and I couldn't. He stopped. I could not reach for it, because I would not have you feel like you owed me an emotion, because I'd felt one first. She looked at him. That's the most stubborn, most careful, most exactly like you thing you have ever said, she said. He was quiet for a second. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Yes, he said. I don't owe you anything, she said. I want you. There's the difference you taught me. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. I know, he said. I know that now. They sat like that for a moment. The food got cold. Neither of them moved to fix it. Gao. It was Decker who forced the last piece of the story out into the open, as Decker tended to force things not loudly, but with the directness of a man who had watched something for a long time and decided it had been private long enough. He came by the ranch one last time in early May, passing through on his way back to Billings, now that the hail situation had resolved and his land was no longer under threat. He sat in the kitchen, everyone ended up in the kitchen, and drank coffee and said very little for a while, in the comfortable way of a man who doesn't need to fill silence. Then he looked at Caleb and said, You told her. Caleb said, She found the chest. Decker looked at Lillian. How'd you take it? Badly at first, she said. Then differently. He nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected. He used to talk about you, Decker said. Not often. Once, twice, maybe in 6 years. But when he did, he shook his head. I've known a lot of men who said they were waiting for the right woman. Most of them meant they were waiting for an easy one. He looked at Caleb. He meant it differently. What did he mean? Lillian said. Decker looked at her directly. He meant he was waiting for you. Not a version of you that was convenient. Not you arriving under better circumstances. You, however you arrived, whenever you arrived, if you arrived. He paused. That's not the same thing as what most people mean. She looked at Caleb. Caleb was looking at his coffee. You never told me that part, she said. Which part? He said. The if part, she said. In your letters you said you'd wait, and if you came you'd want me to know certain things. But I always read that as you were sure I'd come eventually. He looked up. I wasn't sure, he said. I hoped. There's a difference, she said in his words back to him. Yes, he said. She sat with that. 6 years of hoping. Not certainty, not inevitability. Hope, which is the harder thing. Hope requires accepting that the answer might be no, and choosing to hold on anyway. Decker, she said, thank you. He shrugged. I've been watching him be patient for 6 years, he said. Seemed like you should know the whole of it. Gag. Decker left before noon. They stood in the yard and watched him go, the sound of the motorcycles fading down the ranch road. And then it was quiet, in the way that Broken Ridge was always quiet. Not empty, just settled. Lillian turned to go back inside. Caleb said, wait. She turned. He was reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out an envelope. He held it for a moment before he handed it to her. She looked at it. Another letter, she said. The last one, he said. I wrote it the night you found the chest, after you went upstairs. She took it. She held it. Can I read it now? She said. That's why I'm giving it to you, he said. She opened it. The handwriting was the same, his careful, deliberate hand that she would know anywhere now. But the words were different from all the ones before. The ones before had been written in the past tense about things observed from a distance. This one was present tense. This one was addressed directly to her. Lillian, you found the chest. I heard you come back inside, and I heard you sit at the table, and I knew what you'd read, and I knew what you must be thinking. And I did not come downstairs because you needed time to think it, and I would not take that from you. I need to say one thing that the other letters didn't say, because the other letters were not for you. They were for me to hold what I couldn't carry otherwise. This one is for you. You came here with nothing. That is true. And you came here afraid, which I knew, though you never showed it, because a person who is not afraid does not hold themselves as carefully as you did in those first weeks. You were carrying yourself like something that might break, and you were working every hour to make sure it didn't. I want you to know something about that. It was never desperation that I saw in you. Not once. Not that first afternoon at the table, not in the weeks after. What I saw, what I have always seen every time I have been in a room with you, is a person who refuses to stop, who finds the edge of everything she has and then goes a little further, who looks around any room she's in for the person who needs something. You gave your coat to a stranger's family 6 years ago. I saw it. You didn't know anyone was watching. That is who you are. That has always been who you are. You did not marry me because you were desperate. You married me because you were brave enough to ask for what you needed from the only person you had left to ask. And I said yes, because you were always the person I hoped would find me. Caleb. She read it twice. She folded it carefully. She put it in her coat pocket against her chest. She did not trust her voice immediately, so she stood there for a moment in the May morning with the sound of the ranch around her, the cattle in the distance, the dog moving somewhere near the barn, the particular alive quality of a working place that is working well. Then she said, "You wrote this after I went upstairs." "Yes," he said. "How long did it take you?" "About an hour," he said. "Why an hour?" "Because I wrote it 4 times before I got it right," he said. She looked at him. "Come here," she said. He came. She put her hand against his chest, flat over his heart, which she had never done before. She felt its steady present exactly like the man himself. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I know," he said. "I mean it as a choice," she said. "Not as a situation. I am choosing to stay here. I am choosing you. I need you to understand the difference." His hand came up and covered hers. "I understand," he said. "Good," she said. She left her hand there for another moment. Then she stepped back, because there was work to do. There was always work to do. And that was not a burden anymore. That was simply the texture of a life she had built in a place she had chosen. "The summer grazing rotation needs to be filed with the county by Friday," she said. "I know," he said. "And the Marcus Greer contract renewal is due end of the month." "I know that too," he said. "And Doris is coming Thursday for what she is calling a social call, but is actually curiosity," he said. "Significant curiosity," she agreed. He almost smiled. The almost smile she had catalogued and treasured for months, that had graduated somewhere in the past weeks into the real thing, often enough that she no longer kept careful count of it. "Lillian," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you happy?" She considered it the way she considered all important questions, fully honestly from every angle. "Yes," she said. "I am." He nodded once. It was a complete sentence, that nod. It said everything he would have said if he'd had 10,000 words to use. She turned and walked back toward the house. At the porch steps she stopped. "Caleb." "Yes." "The letters," she said. "The ones in the chest. All 6 years of them." She looked at him over her shoulder. "I've read every one." "I know," he said. "I'm going to keep them," she said. "I know that too," he said. "Good," she said, and went inside. What happened next was not the end of the story. There are no ends, really, only places where a chapter closes and the next one opens too quietly to hear. But if you were to look at Broken Ridge Ranch, in the months that followed the summer that came in warm and forgiving after the brutal winter, the cattle operation running cleaner and stronger than it had in years, The kitchen table that had become a kind of gathering place for half the valley, you would see something that was not visible in January. You would see two people who moved through the same house, not as strangers, maintaining an agreement, not as partners managing a transaction, but as something that had no efficient word for it. Something that had been built carefully and honestly from the raw material of desperation and patience, and 6 years of quiet letters, and a woman who showed up at a door in January with nothing and gave everything she had to a life she hadn't known she was choosing. Doris Faherty told anyone who would listen that it was the most romantic thing she had ever personally witnessed, and she had witnessed a considerable amount. Vera Hutchins said at the post office that she had always thought they were well suited. She said it without irony, and with the confidence of a woman who has successfully revised her own history. Decker, when he was asked about it by one of his men on the ride back to Billings, said, "Only, some things take the time they take," and didn't say anything else. And Caleb Walker, who had spent 6 years writing letters he never sent to a woman he never approached, who had left a door unlocked and waited and hoped and refused to reach for something that wasn't freely offered. Caleb Walker came in from the north pasture one evening in July to find his wife at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a ledger and the particular focused expression that meant she was 3 steps ahead of a problem and working her way to the solution. He stood in the doorway. She looked up. "Done," she said. "For today," he said. "Coffee's still hot," she said, and went back to the ledger. He poured himself coffee. He sat down across from her. He picked up the document she'd set to the side and read it, because that was what they did. They worked, they talked, they sat in the comfortable silence of two people who had long since stopped performing for each other and were simply fully present. He had waited 6 years for this. It had been worth every single one. Lillian Whitmore had arrived at Broken Ridge with nothing and built something that neither of them could have built alone. Not just the accounts, not just the legal fight, not just the Valley's trust. Something truer and harder to name and more durable than any of it. She had not married Caleb Walker because she was desperate. She had married him because she was brave. And she had loved him because once she finally let herself look clearly at who he was, there was simply no other honest conclusion to reach. That was the whole of it. That was enough.